This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In Florida, a school voucher program allows public dollars to pay for students to attend private campuses. It's a billion-dollar business, but one that operates with a surprisingly low level of oversight. That includes a hands-off approach to the questionable curriculum being used at some religious schools. Joining us today to talk about their reporting is Leslie Postal and Annie Martin of the Orlando Sentinel. They've been digging deep into these issues for more than a year. Leslie, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
And Annie, great to have you here as well.
Thanks for having me.
So this story actually starts a little further back with a series last fall called Schools Without Rules, in which you took a close look at the private campuses that are benefiting from public vouchers. Leslie, why did you want to start there?
Really what got us started were two things. President Trump and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos visited one of our local Catholic schools that take all three of the state's scholarship or voucher programs. And about the same time, a woman who ran two separate private schools, was arrested and charged with Medicaid fraud. And I think those two things, while the president was touting these programs and saying, he would like to see them replicated nationwide, we had a really troubling case here where two women actually were accused of basically stealing money from these students' Medicaid accounts. So I think that those were the two initial things that got us looking at this.
You went to see some of these schools and spend some time in the classroom, and that's when some of the lessons that were being taught caught your attention. Annie, tell me what you saw.
What we learned immediately upon visiting these schools is that a lot of them were using curricula that's very different from what you would find in the public schools. One of the first schools that we visited used a program called Accelerated Christian Education, where basically the students are sitting in cubicles for most of the day with little interaction with their classmates or with their teacher, filling out workbooks. And the schools that we visited that use this program spoke very highly of it. They said that students can pretty much learn at their own pace, and they acted like the public schools were forcing students to, stay with their classmates, so they were holding them back, whereas this allowed them to move ahead at their own pace. And we thought that was really interesting. And while we couldn't delve too deeply into that in our first series, it was something we wanted to expand upon down the road.
And Leslie, these are pretty low-tech workbooks and instructional approaches, aren't they?
For the Accelerated Christian program, yes. I mean, these are if you look at them, they're very low-budget workbooks with thin paper, and there's just pages of text and then pages of multiple-choice questions, typically very simple questions. One said, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 18 whatever, and then the question a page later is, when did Eli Whitney invent the cotton gin? I mean, they're nothing that would prompt broader thinking about anything. It was all find the exact answer, put it down.
You compared the expectations of the Christian text for third graders with more typical state-level expectations on reading comprehension, and you found a pretty big gap. Why is third grade the right place to focus here?
Well, in Florida, third grade is the year when students can be held back. If they don't pass the state reading test, they can be barred from fourth grade. That was one of, the hallmarks of former Governor Bush's education reform efforts. So in third grade public schools, students are expected to be reading both fiction and nonfiction, and are expected to be able to, pull answers from several different texts. If you look at samples from our state third grade reading test, they might have to read a story about butterflies and then a factual piece about butterflies and answer questions, writing a paragraph in their own words. When we had people review some of these materials, they said most of the stories were third grade appropriate, but they were kind of just simple kids' stories. They weren't a lot of nonfiction, and they didn't seem to have the same level of write your own answers or pull information from a variety of places.
Annie, it's probably easy to laugh at the idea of a textbook that would say that Noah's Ark included dinosaurs. But really, there's some serious concerns here about the content that's being taught to these children, isn't there?
A lot of people that we spoke with who were critical of this program were willing to draw the line between it's okay if you want to teach that dinosaurs and man were on Earth at the same time, on your own dime, in Sunday school or in that type of environment. But if you're receiving public money there should be some restriction on what you can teach. You should be teaching information that's backed up by science in a science class. And certainly some of the professors that we spoke with made it very clear to us that this type of instruction is not going to prepare you to attend a four-year public university.
Leslie, there are also some serious concerns here about how social studies are being taught and glossing over some really painful periods in U.S. history, for example, our legacy of slavery, but then also teaching ideas that run counter to religious inclusion.
Right. Some of the books, in fact, I think all three of the companies that we looked at, they did seem to have a real anti-Catholic bias, kind of saying, thank goodness God let Protestants flourish in North America and kept Catholics to the South. Slavery was definitely downplayed. There were a section that said slaves who knew Christ were better off than free men who did not. The Civil War in one section was sort of portrayed as something that, although terrible, it brought more people to Christ. I'd say the civil rights movement was really downplayed, and one of the books really focused on the riots after Martin Luther King's assassination rather than his importance in American history. So there were a lot of things like that. I will say, the professor we spoke to did say that this has historically been a problem in textbooks, telling white men's history, but he thought these were particularly egregious. And any religion that wasn't Christian was definitely described in a sort of patronizing way, or that they were wrong. They didn't really know God, or they had false gods.
Well, that again makes it a little awkward here, because you're suggesting that maybe there should be some state oversight of a religious school, but it sort of has to be, doesn't it? Because again, we circle back to that issue of the public dollar.
Right. I'm not going to suggest what the answer should be, but obviously there is this weird thing. As a religious private school, they should be free to do as they want and teach what they want, but it does become awkward when they're taking all this public money.
Have you been able to find any data on students who maybe start out in one of these Christian academies in elementary and then try to move on to middle school in terms of their academic performance or trajectory?
There really isn't much data on that. School districts say anecdotally that students who come back from some of these private schools struggle, but the folks in the choice movement will also say, rightly, that the kids who take these scholarships or vouchers are typically the most struggling kids anyway. So it's not surprising that they might be struggling in both places or struggle when they come back. But there really isn't any data that I know of on that.
We're talking with Leslie Postal and Annie Martin of the Orlando Sentinel about their reporting on the state's school voucher program. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. There was a section of your story that really jumped out at me, and that was the Florida Department of Education doesn't track the curriculum being used by more than 140,000 students who attend private school on state vouchers. In fact, and this is a quote, Florida law prohibits the department from asking about or regulating academics at these schools. Leslie, that's nothing new for Florida, is it? The state has long had a hands-off approach to private education.
Correct. And we're soon to have 4 scholarship programs. And the laws that govern them say that teacher quality, the kinds of buildings, what's taught, is not something that the state can regulate at these schools, even if they're taking the public vouchers or scholarships.
So while Florida has a pretty robust open records law, and there's a lot of documents that you can get in Florida, you really had to dig here, didn't you? Because it's voluntary. So how did you go about getting some of this information and the textbooks and the data and getting access to these schools?
Well, the first thing that we did when we were doing our original series, every school we went to, we just said, what curriculum are you using? So that's how we realized there were these 3 main ones that many of the schools were using. Now, it wasn't a perfectly scientific survey, but it did let us know what the most popular were. And then we ordered the current materials from all of the publishers that the schools told us they were using.
So there has been some fallout from your story. Annie, I know you had a follow-up piece when you talked to some lawmakers who expressed concern about this curriculum. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we received some feedback, a lot of positive feedback from people who say that there should be some restrictions on what private schools can teach if they want to participate in the scholarship programs. And we even heard this from lawmakers who were very supportive of the program in general. They just thought that there were some changes that needed to be made in that regard. We also heard, obviously, from a few schools who said, we use this curriculum and we send students to college and they're doing just fine. And why can't we teach science in a way that's, aligns with our religious views? So the feedback that we got was kind of all over the board in that regard. But I think a lot of people were surprised that schools that take public money can teach things like dinosaurs and men were on Earth at the same time and things that are well outside, mainstream academics. I think that was a surprise to a lot of people.
Annie, was there anything about this project that surprised you?
I would say a lot of things really surprised me. When we would go into the schools, we would see students using these books, but we didn't really know what they were like until we ordered them for ourselves. And I, like a lot of people, didn't realize how different these materials were from things that you would see in a public school.
For reporters who may be covering voucher programs or even something similar like a scholarship program in their own state, I'd love it if you'd share some tips for them on questions they should be asking about this.
Well, I think the first thing is if they can go visit a lot of these schools, that's the best thing to do. I mean, it's really basic reporting, but it was so eye-opening to us. I think we visited 35 schools last year, and we saw a huge range of places, but we also saw a lot of things that seemed possibly troubling or worrisome, from the types of facilities to how the classes were run. But we were also surprised how many places let us in. So if you can just get out there and knock on doors or make appointments, that's great. And a lot of these people were actually quite proud of what they were doing. And some of them, obviously, rightly so, they're doing good work. So go visit the schools. That would be my first tip.
Right. And also ask the State Department of Education for any data they do collect on schools in this program. Obviously, Florida doesn't collect much, but that might be different in other states. And ask for any parent complaints that have come in about schools that participate in the program. That was a really good source of information for us and helped us find some parents that were willing to talk about their experiences.
Right. And we didn't initially realize that there were such complaint forms and that the state had them. But once we did, those were public records in Florida. And like Annie said, they were really a treasure trove of information for us.
Those are great suggestions. So I've got a couple of story ideas for you for follow-up, and I'm hoping that some graduates of these schools will get in touch with you and tell you how well prepared they actually believe that they were, as opposed to that secondhand information. I'd love to read that profile.
That would be good.
Definitely.
One thing I would definitely encourage education reporters to look at is the finances of these private schools as much as they can get them, and even just enrollment numbers. I thought it was fascinating that at some of these schools in Florida, more than 90% of their students are coming on these voucher programs.
We had quite a few school directors tell us we would not exist without the state voucher programs, that's what allows us to thrive.
Annie Martin and Leslie Postal cover education for the Orlando Sentinel. Their colleague Beth Cassib also contributed to this project. Annie, Leslie, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.